Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast, Troubleshooting Office 365 End-to-End, turning interruption into insight. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia. I'm a Microsoft MVP. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started today's webcast. The webcast is being recorded, so you'll be getting a notification via email in a day or so after the webcast is over with a link to that recording. So don't worry about that in case you have to miss it or you want to send it to a colleague, friend, and so on and so forth. If you have any issues, use the chat. You can talk to some of the folks who are working on the back end to make sure that everything runs smoothly in today's webcast. And as always, utilize the Q&A and make sure you use that so we can have Q&A time at the end to answer any of the questions that you might have about anything that we're talking about today as well. So let's actually jump in and let me introduce our other speaker that we have today. I'm also joined by Rob Doucette. Rob's the Vice President of Product Management over at Martello. He's got more than 15 years of experience building market-driven solutions with a focus on real-time diagnostics, monitoring, and analytics. Rob, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Nick. Glad to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, should be a good topic here. So if you guys look at the agenda here on the bottom right, you can see we got three basic things we want to talk about today. First, we want to talk about why looking at Office 365 and troubleshooting it requires, first off, end-to-end monitoring, or talk a little bit about what that even is as well. Then we're going to dive in a little deeper and talk about what metrics, what data, what events, what kinds of pieces of information are actually going to be helpful to not just be information, not just be, but actually all the way to be actionable. You can do something about it. So we want to be actionable insight, and it's just not looking at, well, someone's having a problem. That's not really enough to do anything about, but it's trying to figure out who's got the problem, what's the scope of the problem, how many people are impacted. Those kind of things actually will help, and we want to talk about some of that as well, so you can actually do some remediation of those issues should they come into play. And then the last one here at the bottom that you see is basically how to improve your ability to not just identify that there is a problem, but actually respond to it. Both what I wrote it as quickly and effectively, meaning you can do something about it is pretty much within the shortest amount of time possible. The conversation that we're going to have today is a little different. You're probably used to death by PowerPoint, 80 slides in 22 minutes or something ridiculous, right? So instead today, we have literally 3 slides, and Rob's got a couple of screenshot slides that he's going to use to kind of talk to a couple of things. But by and large, Rob and I are just going to have a discussion today. It's going to take 3 slides. If you don't see the slides advancing today, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with your screen. There's nothing wrong with GoToMeeting. We're just really using the slides as more of a visual indicator of what we're talking about. So in this case, you get to sit back and relax and just enjoy the conversation, as well as we'd love to have you again, put some stuff in the Q&A box and participate in the conversation as we go through this. So where we're going to start here is, if you're monitoring Microsoft 365, does it have to be end to end? And so if you guys think about this, anytime you've moved anything to the cloud, you always lose kind of 2 things. You lose visibility and control. Now, control we're not so much worried about because Microsoft provides a lot of functionality given back to you of the parts that you do want to control of your Microsoft 365 instance. However, the visibility part still gets reduced because they control a really material portion of the stack. You just really control sort of the usage of the stack, but they're controlling the rest of it. So it becomes kind of a problem. And Microsoft themselves, even though it's Microsoft, they're like every other company. They're susceptible to having issues with being able to deliver services. I mean, I put up here, I went and grabbed a quick screenshot. They even have a Microsoft 365 status Twitter feed just to be able to tell you there's a problem with this particular service, this particular functionality. We're working on it now. They'll tell you when it's been restored, that kind of thing, as well as some service health dashboards within the actual product. But the idea here is that they know they have issues enough to the point where they want to make sure they're able to communicate with you so that you're not going to be able to avoid that. And then if you really think about it, the problem that someone might call the help desk with, hey, I'm having a problem with Teams and I keep getting kicked out of a call, it might not even be Microsoft. It might be something where instead it's a latency issue, a bandwidth issue, a connectivity issue that the person's having themselves, if it's just one individual. Or maybe it's something with a particular location. It's everybody in that office is having a problem because maybe the internet connection there is bad, or maybe it might not be Microsoft. We want to talk a little bit about that as well, and that's sort of why we start getting down to that. Let's look at this from an end-to-end perspective, sort of from endpoint to service and everything in between. And then one of the other challenges here is if you utilize any particular monitoring tool, even the alerting and the status updates that Microsoft has, it's only giving you a glimpse into their aspect of the overarching picture of connectivity that exists. We have to go all the way again from the endpoint to the service, and any given monitoring tool more than likely is just showing you one portion of the overarching picture. So It's important to be trying to figure out how do I do this from an end-to-end perspective more than anything. And that actionable insight that we're trying to get to, it actually involves a couple pieces of information that Rob and I are going to talk about in a second here. You want to figure out who's impacted, so that way you can kind of get the scope of what part of your user base is actually having an issue. Is it one person? Again, is it an office? Is it the entire business? Those kinds of things. What services are disrupted? In the case of, let's say, if it's just Exchange, that's okay, it's just email that's disrupted. But we all know, of course, with Teams on the back end is OneDrive and SharePoint, and so a portion of Exchange a little bit, and there's a couple other services inside the Microsoft 365 platform that get utilized. So it might be a number of services that all get disrupted just by one thing going down. And then the last thing I've got here is if it's possible to determine what's the root cause. And the end-to-end monitoring, the larger the scope of your end-to-end monitoring, like the closer you can get to truly end-to-end, doing air quotes there, that's where you're going to be able to try and determine what the root cause is. So Rob, I got a couple of questions here. I want to pull you in on a conversation and talk about this issue of, why we need end-to-end monitoring. The first one I wrote down here was, maybe we could start discussing sort of the impact that the lack of visibility has on organizations that are relying on Microsoft 365. So Microsoft, of course, provides the service health updates and that kind of thing. But how are customers indicating to you that this isn't enough?
Yeah, like to your point, the root of this is the lack of visibility, where historically, companies would deploy some of these application servers in their own offices, right? You had Exchange and AD and SharePoint servers running in your own environments. You had things like System Center or maybe SolarWinds or other, IT management systems or monitoring systems that were looking after the health, making sure all these databases and server components and things were running. And that's how, IT said, yep, everything is green and running. All that has moved into Microsoft's Datacenter. IT teams have no visibility into those components anymore, yet they're still responsible to make sure that that service is delivered to their users. So you're hear me talk a little bit about being proactive, right, or having a proactive posture, because if you wait until the users find a problem, now you're scrambling in this reactive mode trying to figure out how to fix this problem, and you're under pressure to fix it because users are waiting for you to do so.
It's interesting. You hit it on the head. IT's still responsible, and that's those of you in the audience, that they're still going to come to you going, "Hey, Teams is having a problem," and you're like, "Well, it's Microsoft." And even though your upper level management might accept that answer, they still don't like the answer. So the closer you can get to trying to resolve the problem, the better here. Next question I had written for you, Rob, is the idea of monitoring. I kind of already insinuated it, and that it means potentially going all the way from the endpoint itself. So it could be someone's laptop or whatever device they're using, and so on. The network path that they take to the Microsoft cloud, and then finally to the Microsoft 365 service themselves. So do you think this is important to be able to do that entire kind of spectrum, and if so, why?
Yeah, definitely. I think the screenshot you've actually put is a good example, right? If we look at what it says users may have an impact with a whole list of services. Well, that doesn't really help the IT team much, right? I'd like to know if they are having problems, and if they are, which service. So, the more visibility that we can provide from a user experience perspective, right? What exactly is that user doing, and not just, taking a look at Microsoft's service health status that says, oh, there's a bunch of problems with a few services, but we don't really know what that impact is. Can people send emails? Can they hold meetings? So being able to, and we'll get into this in the screenshots here, is looking at this from a synthetic perspective, right? Making sure that, you have a monitoring strategy in place that accurately and adequately mimics what your users do, right? We're not just pinging, office.com and saying, yeah, everything is good. We actually need to be able to understand how do users interact with those applications, and are those things working?
Yeah, I'm in violent agreement there. The user experience, I've actually got that written on a slide, I think 2 slides ahead or so, but that's really what, if you think about it, those of you in the audience, that's what you actually care about. You really don't care whether SharePoint Online is up and running, because maybe your business doesn't even use SharePoint Online. You care about how your business, that is your users, are affected by it. So Rob, I know you've got a couple of examples. Could you share some of those examples of sort of where the monitoring end-to-end provides some of that actionable perspective?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this would be, perfect. So I've got a Power BI dashboard here, that's reflecting data that we collect with our Martello Gizmo product. And just to give a little context, it basically works through the concept of a robot which lives close to your users, and that robot synthetically executes transactions that mimic what your users are doing. So we can see here on this map, how well those users are interacting. I might be able to quickly identify if there's a problem just in APAC, for example, or if there's a global issue happening. And really the key is the synthetic part, right? This is not a wait until the user tells me there's a problem, or find out by looking at a log file or something that Nick did have a bad experience. I'm running these things on behalf of Nick so that ideally the IT team could be notified before Nick even gets into the office that there would be a problem if he tried to have a Teams call. So let's try and fix that before he comes into the office.
Mm-hmm. Makes good sense. I like that.
And then to my point about not just pinging or understanding that SharePoint's available from the perspective of the Microsoft data center, Gizmo's strength really is in close mimicking of what users actually do. And here is just a screenshot that shows some examples, right, where we're actually using the APIs that Microsoft uses in their thick clients and Outlook and Teams and SharePoint, PowerPoint, those kinds of things, where users aren't always accessing these services just through a web browser. Many users still use the thick clients that Microsoft publishes. So it's important that we use the same APIs and mechanisms that users do to understand, is it an authentication problem? Can they open their mailbox? Can they book a meeting? Can they search through their inbox? All these things are very specific actions that are available through the APIs, and we mimic them very closely so that we can kind of hone in on exactly where that problem is.
What's powerful about this is it provides a lot of context as I look at this, because it's great to have like the speedometer thing there at the top, like your red, green, blue, kind of red, green, yellow thing, right? That telling you if it's good or bad. But then there's an ability for someone who's responsible for this to kind of dig in and first off figure out, like I'm noticing up at the top, you've got Boston and Singapore and the CEO and the COO and so on. You're able to kind of digest, is it one particular area, one particular user having a problem, and so on, and then figuring out what kinds of functions aren't working. You agree?
Yeah, exactly. And you get some perspective too if we can hone in and see, there is a problem in Singapore and it seems to be, DNS resolution and TCP connect time, for example. Okay, I have a bit of a clue to kind of start digging in with the network team to see what's going on, right? And it's not a global issue because people in Boston are fine and people in Switzerland are fine. So it already gives me some understanding of the scope of the issue.
No, love that. In fact, let's talk a little bit about digging into this a little bit and figure out what metrics and the data and the events that are possible, because there's a ton of information that could be utilized here. But what's actually going to give that insight that's necessary for so that you guys in the audience there have an ability to actually do something afterwards and either remediate or at least communicate or do something to make it better instead of just going, I don't know, it's Microsoft. That's not a good enough answer. And so the thing I want you to do first off is at a very high level is start thinking about it in terms of the sources that are possible. And there's sort of two very high level sources, and you'll kind of laugh when you see these because they're extremely high level. It's us and them. Those are the two sources. I know that seems a little ridiculous, like what? Well, is it them? Is it Microsoft? That's the first source. So is it the platform? Is it the services? Is it their connectivity? Is it something internal to them that you have no control over? Or is it us? Is it something that we have an ability to have some kind of impact on, or at least potentially, where maybe it's, for example, if you were to force all of your users to connect via VPN to the corporate office, and then you route all the Office 365 traffic through the office, through a couple of different, let's say some security scanners and things that are checking, for any kind of malware, whatever the case is, and then eventually route through the corporate network and then out to Microsoft. Well, then it's us. It could be us. Anyways, it could be all those systems slowing things down. It could be the user's connectivity to the corporate office. Whatever the case is, maybe their VPN just down. It depends, but you got to think of it in those kind of two high-level areas. And if you dig a little deeper here, then going back to this issue that Rob brought up, the idea of the user experience, you think of all the things that go into that user experience. And I've got kind of a list here. I'm going to bring all these up here. And you think about everything that the user kind of involves themselves with or touches directly. on one end at the top, you have the services. But if you start following this down, you see I've sort of listed them in a format of a spectrum of, on one end at the bottom of the list is the device, the user themselves. Then you have the application. I'm going to kind of work that direction. The application they're using, because they could be using the Teams web browser client, or they could be using the full Teams stick client that exists for the OS. Then there's the routing. How do they get there? They issue the VPN, the routing through the office, those kind of things. The connectivity could be the connectivity from the business to Microsoft's platform, could even be technically the connectivity from the user to their own Wi-Fi, to the internet, and so on. That's not really have a lot of control, but it would be nice to know if possible. And then you have things like authentication. Microsoft has had a lot of authentication issues. Like I think it was the end of September, the beginning of October, there was a couple of different days that had very specific issues around just authentication. And it didn't affect everybody, but it did affect a large number of their customers, and then eventually the services. So you start thinking about all those different facets, and to Rob's kind of point he was making last two slides about using synthetic monitoring, you have this ability to kind of think about it from monitoring each aspect of those, that part of the user experience. And then if you look at the last part here, what you're trying to, whatever metric you're going to use, you're trying to figure out how that's going to correlate with all the other sources. And that's part of going back to the issue of end-to-end monitoring. You're not just trying to look at one thing, like how's my DNS doing? You're trying to figure out, well, if it's not DNS, then I need to know the 17 other things it could be, so I can correlate them together to go, is it a problem? And also, Rob made the example of, okay, Singapore's having a DNS problem, but it looks like Boston's not having a DNS problem. So you're starting to correlate information, so it's important to have that. Rob, a couple of questions that I wrote here. So there's obviously a whole bunch of places that our audience could be looking at to try and find the source of a problem here. And then the good troubleshooting practices would always sort of dictate that you start with either the service that's having the issue, or maybe the user that's saying that they're having a problem, that one end of the spectrum or the other, as it were, that sort of thing. So where do you normally tell customers to place their focus so they can effectively sort of identify the problem and potentially remediate the issue?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it starts by having good visibility into those synthetic transactions that we talked about earlier, so that we know, we might see that SharePoint is online from the perspective of Microsoft, but if users aren't able to authenticate or access, that's a good place. And I think it's, I can point out, the outages that you referred to a month or so ago. Many of our existing customers saw a lot of benefit in being first proactively notified that this is a Microsoft global issue before Microsoft's tweets went out on this. And you might be thinking, well, so what? What can you do about it, right? There's a problem with Microsoft. It's not like you can fix it. But there's a lot of value in at least being able to proactively notify your employees or customers, in the case of your business, that it is a global issue. There's nothing you can do about it. Hang tight. This is what is affected, these sets of applications. Otherwise, the employees and customers are going to go into your ticket system, create a bunch of tickets, call your IT team and complain, and overload your team and create a bunch of work for something that you can't really do. So even in the simple case of there's a problem with Microsoft and there's nothing you can do about it, just being a little bit proactive in the notifications is already a nice value add.
It certainly demonstrates that IT's on top of things, if nothing else, but that doesn't help fix the problem, but it does help a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I know you got a couple of slides over here. Do you want to talk about these a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. So this one dives into a bit on Teams, which of course is seeing explosive growth this year. So we're getting a lot of attention around Teams. And again, just being able to take a view at this top level. I think I like how you said that, Nick. Like, yeah, I see 98.38 at the top. Wow, sounds great. But when I start looking through here, if I look at the bottom right here, I can see I've got probably 2 C levels that are very unhappy, right? 100% packet loss. That's pretty awful. So, those 2 users are having a pretty bad day or a bad experience right now. So we want to start to dig in and find out what's going on. And that's where I can start looking at these graphs. I see, some connection time and authentication times are peaking for those users. So it gives me some hints in terms of where to look at and where not to look at, right? I know this is not a Microsoft global issue. I know those 2 users are in the same location. Okay, that gives me a little bit more information. Maybe it's something with the infrastructure in the office that they're working in, or maybe there is a regional problem in that region. But I already can at a glance, get quite a bit of information in terms of where I should focus my efforts.
Yeah, there's also an opportunity here to triage a little bit. You can see, if everyone's having a problem, but you also see that the COO and the CTO are having problems, you can obviously prioritize a little better and that sort of thing. So there's some interesting functionality there. How about this one?
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out too, this is some visibility into ADFS. So we have, we still see a lot of hybrid deployments, whether there's edge servers on-prem, connected AD environments, and that's a big part of understanding how well this is performing as well. We have an example here with a couple locations being monitored with authentication times. I can see that Shanghai is quite a bit slower from authentication perspective. That might be something to look into. Things like, am I routing properly between the office and the data center? That could be a DNS problem. Could be going into an inefficient front door to get to Microsoft. So again, some things that I can look at even in the hybrid models, which again, we still see a large number of the larger and very large enterprises still using hybrid deployments, and that introduces some extra complexities in terms of understanding where those problems might be.
Good stuff here. So let's talk a little bit about our audience obviously wants to take this data and figure out how they can respond to issues. That's the issue. They didn't just want to be notified. If that's the case, you can just use the Twitter handle, or you can use the service health dashboard within Microsoft 365. You want to be able to do something about it as much as you can. In some cases, as Rob already pointed out, if you just find out it's a worldwide outage, like YouTube had an outage yesterday, like everyone was affected. There's nothing you can do. I mean, it's their service. And that does happen with Microsoft 365. So the idea here is that it isn't just about alerting. Certainly, when Rob pointed out, in some cases, all you can do is just communicate to your users and go, there's a problem, these services, Microsoft's working on it, don't call the help desk. Sure, I mean, that's something. But it shouldn't just be about letting you know there's a problem. It should also actually provide some ability to fix some of that problem. And I think even looking at the last 2 slides ago that Rob had, we showing all the different teams data, there was even up on the right-hand side, this sort of breakout of the amount of time that was being taken by a given client to access Teams and what was taking the most time. And that provides you some ability to go, oh, it looks like it's an authentication problem, or maybe just a connectivity problem overall, or whatever. But you have some kind of context there to figure out, is it us, is it them? And if it's us, what can we do about it? Or if it's them, who's impacted, and therefore we know where to focus our efforts. And I want you to think about this from sort of 2 different aspects here. One that we talked about was this idea of the user experience. Certainly looking at this, that's what synthetic monitoring I think is really good for, is the fact that it's providing this really valuable way of demonstrating what does an average user or a very specific user, as the case would be, what does the experience look like for them? Is it slow? Is it fine? Are they having issues with certain applications? Or that kind of thing. But then also the other end of that is the service-oriented kind of aspect, where you are paying attention to whether or not the services themselves are having problems. And to Rob's point, being able to know that that's happening early on does give you an ability to do something about the problem, even if it is just limited to communicating. And so this end-to-end monitoring also, if you have the ability to look from the device to the service, as it were, that's giving you this ability to really granularly try to figure out, not just down to let's say location, which we've talked about, like Boston and Singapore, but something like a user that's pretending to be a user that's going across Wi-Fi versus one that's going over a hardwired network connection. Things like that. One that's actually going directly to Microsoft because their VPN has dual paths and it can actually just send the Microsoft traffic directly out instead of connecting to the office, and the person that connects to the office. That kind of thing. So you start being able to see the differences and go, oh, looks like the problem is, and it's maybe something that you can control, and you want to have that granular level monitoring in there as well. And that allows for these different, very specific scenarios that I've been talking about here. And then the idea here is that when you can isolate on that, then you're able to keep your response very specific to that, as opposed to going, we're not sure, we just know the Teams is having an outage. I mean, you don't look good, and the business is impacted negatively, and you aren't being able to do anything about the problem. So, Rob, I got 3 questions for this one I wrote down here. And what I want to do is I want to start talking a little bit about the user experience first, and maybe how to monitor that properly. So we have talked a little bit about synthetic monitoring a bit. Would you give the audience sort of a brief explanation of how that synthetic monitoring is sort of accomplishing everything that we've talked about today? Maybe you delved into a little bit. Can you go a little deeper and talk about how maybe it's going to provide some of that granular level monitoring?
Yeah, sure. So like I mentioned, we have this concept of a robot that lives close to the user. It will actually interact with Office 365 with a real user account. And, you know, like I said, it will synthesize the actions that a user would take through those thick clients, right? So it's not a ping or a simple trace route or something. It's actually using the Microsoft, same APIs that Microsoft uses in their clients, and doing very detailed tests, right? It's not even beyond just sending an email or something. We can see, can you book a meeting? Can you search through your inbox? Can you you know, initiate a Teams call? Can you download a file from OneDrive? There's a very granular set of actions there that provides you with a complete picture to understand what's going on. It's not always, you know, we've been talking a little bit about, you know, these global Microsoft issues as if, you know, maybe that's the only issue these teams would run into. That's certainly not the case, right? Microsoft, for the most part, runs a pretty efficient data center, and there's a lot of problems from day to day or week to week that aren't because of Microsoft, but they are because of something closer to your users, right? The network they're on, the device they're using, things like that. And having visibility into those things is really critical to handling the you know, the more regular issues that occur outside of these big Microsoft global issues.
And just so that it's said, you'd have to have a robot per sort of granular aspect that you want to be monitoring. So you'd have to have one in the Boston office, one in the Singapore office, just to be able to do locations. If you want to to represent those on Wi-Fi and those that are hardwired, you'd have to have a robot on a device that's going over Wi-Fi and a robot on a device that's going hardwired, so on, correct?
That's correct. Yep, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So lots of little robots to reflect sort of the different user experiences that the users are going through. I want to transition this looking into more of a service-oriented perspective, because we talked about that a little bit here. Because for many organizations, Microsoft 365 it isn't necessarily the problem. Is that accurate?
Correct. Yeah. No, there's you know, the bulk of the problems are typically the closer to the user you get, the more frequent the problems are, right? You know, we're saying this where Microsoft has had some recent, you know, blips in that track record, but for the most part, their track record is pretty good.
Yeah, they're batting a 999, so to speak. Well, not exactly a 999, but they're doing okay. So I know you got a couple of screenshots here. You want to talk to these for a second?
Yeah, definitely. So this is our services overview, and it might be a little bit hard to read here, but these extra columns that span across this dashboard here provide perspectives into end user visibility, application visibility, and infrastructure visibility. And that's important because, you know, we've been talking a lot about the end user experience and how important that is. But once we have a problem, now we're in this mode of, okay, how do we troubleshoot and get to root cause? And that's where having visibility into application and infrastructure pieces can be really important. So, you know, we talked at the very beginning of the call how, you know, IT has lost visibility into the stack that delivers these SaaS hosted services, but there's still, you know, I'm in an office right now. You know, there's no Microsoft 365 components in this office with me, but there are some network devices between me and the edge of my network that I need to be functioning well for me to have a good experience with the service. You know, many organizations are going to have something very similar. Maybe System Center or SolarWinds or something like that is managing the performance and availability of those devices. And now if I see an end user problem, you know, so my robot has told me in advance of any user telling me that there's some disruption in the Ottawa office where I am right now. And then I see from System Center that it's also complaining and generating some alerts about the egress router in my office. I can start to put those two pieces of data together to understand how well is this service being delivered. And that's really what these line items here reflect, is a complete cross-section of all the things that are needed for this service to function, whether that's network devices in an office, you know, application components in an office, if you have a hybrid deployment, and then the most important kind of leading the detection part of it is the end user experience.
No, I like this. There's a little bit of visibility here that you wouldn't have with the synthetic transactions, because that might say the user's having a challenge getting to a particular service, but this is actually something where, like to your point, if there's a service between the user and the edge of the network, you're actually seeing, oh, that's a problem. It's running slowly, or maybe it's not running at all, as the case would be, and that may be actually part of the problem there. What about this one here?
Yeah, and I think all this leads to the actionable intelligence, like you mentioned, right? We want to give people the information they need to find out where the problem is quickly and fix it. And so one big part of that is better SLA management. So we talked a little bit about, Microsoft publishes their SLAs in the portal, and those are valuable to track, but they're really looking at it from the perspective of the data center, Microsoft's data center. There's a lot of stuff between the data center and the users that can go wrong. And it's important, especially in the case of, if you're an MSP, you're largely on the hook, or at least going to get blamed for problems with that service, probably before they'll blame Microsoft. So being able to have visibility into a true end-to-end SLA is really important. And that's what we're able to do here, is to be able to show, based on those synthetic transactions that provide, again, that end-to-end coverage, how well is this service being delivered to your users? And I can overlay in here the end user experience, but also the application and infrastructure pieces that I just mentioned. And so I have an example dashboard here that shows a service that is rather horrible. So hopefully your services will look better than this. But the idea is, along the bottom as well, we can show you, based on this current month, so November's not going so well, but I might roll up my sleeves at the end of November and convince my boss not to fire me because I'm going to do a much better job in December. And the way I can be convincing with that argument is, in the bottom here, I'll actually be highlighted into, well, what were the things that led to downtime in November? So I can see that there was some infrastructure in Boston, or there was a network device in my Ottawa office. If I fix that, I have a high level of confidence that my SLA in December, outside of brand new issues popping up, will be much improved.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So let's do this. Let's take a couple of questions. I've got a couple in the Q&A box already, and happy to get more as well. So if you guys have questions, make sure you stick those in the Q&A box, and we'll be happy to ask those real quick. So a couple that I've got here, they said they've got users that are working from home, and they're utilizing Zscaler, so they're directly connecting into Microsoft. Can we still accomplish this end-to-end view?
Definitely, yep. So we can go through proxies and the cloud access brokers. That can certainly be, and that's actually a use case that we hear quite a bit, because the often cases these proxies or brokers can get blamed for poor service, right? Because, well, I've got this thing in between me and Office 365. It must be that's causing this problem. And these tool sets can be used to eliminate that as a source of blame.
Yeah, it does provide that perspective, because you could do something that goes outside Zscaler just for point of reference, just to demonstrate whether it is or isn't. So yeah. Another question is, to be able to do these checks from the user device, it says, is that done by an agent? You talked about a robot, so I think they get a little more technical. Is that done by an agent? And then what do you do about BYOD devices?
Yeah, so today that you could deploy this on your laptop as a Windows service. Today, you wouldn't get that visibility for, let's say, your mobile device. If you're roaming around, you would have to have a laptop or a desktop or some server infrastructure to run that today. But we see, regionally speaking, there's quite a bit of value that can be provided just by having robots strategically placed in the regions where your users are, even if it's not right on Nick's mobile phone as he kind of roams around outside of the office, if you're doing that these days, because that already gives you some visibility. How well is Ottawa working, Boston, Shanghai, some of the examples that we showed in the dashboards earlier, and that often gives you 90+% of the equation in terms of, is there a problem in that region? Is there a DNS problem? Am I going to the wrong data center? That type of thing.
And just to put a little bit of qualifier in there, because we did demonstrate or showed something in one of the screenshots. In theory, although there's a lot that you're not able to necessarily look at with this, but if you had a CIO or a CEO that was using, let's say, literally their personal device, or they were using an iPad or something at home, and that's where they work from all the time, you could, in theory, still go like ship them a laptop with a robot agent on there and be at least testing the connectivity from their home. Doesn't give you a full picture, but I mean, so you mentioned 90%. I'm like thinking more like it's like the 80-20 rule kind of a thing where you're going to get most everything. Does that sound about right to you though as well?
Exactly, yeah. And we have some other options that some customers have used with compute sticks in terms of a real simplified way to deploy a robot in your office. So there are lots of options there in terms of getting the coverage that our customers are looking for.
Okay, another good question. By the way, I know that we're over by 5 minutes for those of you in the audience. Just there's a bunch of questions that have come in, so I want to make sure we get them all. So definitely respecting your time. If you have to drop off, again, you'll be getting a recording of this, but we're going to keep going with the questions as long as they're coming in. So so bear with us if you can, and if you can't, again, listen to the recording and you can fast forward to the end and definitely hear the answers to these questions. There's one that's really good here. So we had those gauges, the little dial charts showing the performance, and they're asking, how is that performance score calculated? So can you cover that maybe in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's an aggregate view of the robots that are collecting this information. So it's giving you kind of a global perspective, although you can slice and dice that in different ways. But if I just want a very top level measure in terms of how well that service is being delivered, if that's 99.9, I probably don't need to go further. If I see that number starts to decline, then I want to dig into the next level of detail and find out, okay, why is that number declining? And then I can see, oh, maybe it's Boston, maybe it's Shanghai, and get to that next level. So it's meant to be that real top level aggregate view in terms of, do I even need to look further?
Good stuff. So there's a question that's a little bit outside the scope of this. Maybe it's more about the response to an issue, but it says, how can end users working from home optimize their Microsoft 365 experience?
So good question. There's a lot behind that, I guess.
Yep, there is.
I think the root of most of what we see, and there are a number of analysts that kind of talk about this as well, that roughly half of all issues are either the user's device, their Wi-Fi, or their local network in some way, right? And I think most of that these days, given that many of us are working in homes and competing for network resources with either our children or partners. So I think the most common issues that we see would be poor Wi-Fi. So a misconfigured Wi-Fi in the home office. That's probably number one. And then number two would be there's just too much stuff going on in your home. Right, your kids are home playing games or streaming Netflix or something while you're trying to be on a Teams call, and there's just not enough bandwidth at the edge of your network to accommodate all of those workloads.
Yeah, I wrote a white paper for our Martello probably a number of months back, and I covered a lot of that in detail. And I wish I knew the name of it off the top of my head, and I don't. But if you want to read that, you're going to be getting at the end of all this anyways an email from the folks in marketing about next steps, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But if you want to see that email for the person, the white paper, ask them about it and they'll find you a link. But it covers a lot in detail, things like putting quality of service in place so that you can try to get past your kids needing to watch YouTube or something because what you're doing is far more important, that kind of stuff, and how you can optimize that experience a little bit. Next question is saying we have a hybrid platform. They've got some on-prem Exchange. So is this only for Office 365 or can you do on-prem Exchange as well?
Nope, we can definitely do on-prem as well. So same synthetic transactions work for the on-prem deployments as well. And on top of that, the last screenshots that I showed, it's maybe hard to see just from the screenshot, but those views are made up of data coming from a number of different IT management tools, such as SolarWinds, PRTG, App Dynamics, System Center.
If I just put that up real quick, is that this one?
Yeah, so this view here. So yeah, all the data behind this that's determining whether these things are red, yellow, or green are coming from a number of IT monitoring systems. And we have quite a long list. I think we're in the almost 30 different platforms that we support now. And they're plug and play. You tell us where they are, you give some credentials, and we can pull that data in. and then you can map your service together so that you have visibility into, well, what does System Center know about that Exchange server that's on-prem? Let's put that into the service model. What about the network pieces that are there? Maybe there's a dedicated network management solution like SolarWinds. Let's put that in that layer. And so you end up with this really holistic view of the service instead of just one slice of it.
Good stuff. So let me go back to the question slide here. One more question came in, and this looks like it's the last question. But if you've got one, by all means, stick that in the Q&A box. I'm hoping to get them all. Oh, actually, there's another one popped in, so we'll keep going. Can you create or access Windows telemetry directly for internal use? For example, what Windows natively gives to build the user device score?
Today we do not, as far as I know. That's a good point of feedback that I can share with the internal teams here to see what we could do there. Interesting.
All right, and the last one that I have in here is, can some of the performance info be shared with the user, like showing a gauge with on-prem or home network performance?
Yep, definitely. So we can share these out. There's a role-based access control system on top of all of this, so you can control what people can see, what people can do. Whether you want to share these dashboards just with IT teams or managers or individual users is really up to the organization. And even with the last views that we saw with the service perspectives and the SLAs, SLA reports can be generated, exported, mailed to people, so that there's a transparent view into how well the service is being delivered. And we're seeing actually a lot more of that. This desire to be very transparent, even if whether you're an MSP or an enterprise. Sharing this with your employees and customers just to be kind of proactive and transparent about how well this service is being delivered.
Perfect. I think that's the last question. I'm gonna stall for another 10 seconds just in case another one pops in, because sometimes I do, and we want to make sure we're answering your questions. But in lieu of that, I'm going to jump ahead here, and if one comes in, we'll try to do that. As I mentioned, the marketing folks from Martello are going to send each of you an email afterwards with some links to some next steps, so that way you can get some assets. And if you're ready to get a trial, you can go ahead and sign up for that as well, as speak to someone on the Martello team that can tell you more about the Gizmo and IQ products that were featured today. So also, when we close out today's webcast today, there will be a survey at the end. I've been told it's a 4-question survey. I jokingly said a very fast 78-question survey. It's 4 questions, and it's super fast. It takes like 5 seconds. So if you fill out that survey, that just gives them some feedback on today's session as well. And one question did come in. Actually, 2 questions came in, so I'll take them real quick. How do you correctly tune alerting and monitoring? How would you know what kind of latency is normal or acceptable, or how would one define it?
Yeah, so good question. There's a couple angles there. One, Microsoft does publish some standards here in terms of what to expect. That's something they've been doing long from the very early Exchange days, in terms of this is the type of latency you should expect on whether it's authentication, connect times, delivery times, that sort of thing. And some of it is, you have to establish a baseline in your environment, right? Some, depending on the regions that your users are, there might be a little bit higher latency, a little bit lower latency, depending on the access to the data centers that are available in that region. So there's kind of a 2-pronged approach. There's some best practices that are defined by Microsoft in the industry, and then there's some baselining that we would recommend organizations do to understand, is this an anomaly, or is this just, we normally get 100 millisecond connection latency, and that's just life in the region that we're in.
That makes sense. Simple, the idea of baselining, and then moving forward, you tell it over time. Last question then here is, can you use network connectivity as, I'm not sure if I understand this, and hopefully you will, it says, as built-in features from Microsoft to get the connectivity details for some users? They have in parentheses Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Teams. I'm not sure I follow the question. Do you?
I'm assuming it's related to the new network connectivity tool that Microsoft has. Well, I think it's still in preview mode, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Or it's available to a select number of tenants. We provide essentially a superset of the data that Microsoft is providing there. So, we're going to keep an eye, and we work very closely with Microsoft on this to see, are there opportunities for us to leverage what Microsoft is publishing in their tenant. Right now, what we've seen is we kind of cover all of that and then some. But we're always looking at, making sure that we can complement what Microsoft is doing, because we see that as Microsoft has acknowledged, much like you said at the very beginning, Nick, there's an actual Twitter account that's dedicated to this. The fact that Microsoft is creating a network connectivity tool for people to look, acknowledges that this is a problem in terms of people getting reliable access to Office 365. And if there are things in there that we see that we can pull out to augment all the things that we've just talked about today, that's something that we'll definitely do.
Could you imagine if they weren't that way? They were like, "We're not down. You're down. It's not us." It's just, yes, it's you.
Yeah.
You check. It's fine. Light bulb's on in my office. Check your light bulb.
That would simplify the development of that feature. Just kind of spun with the progress for a while and just told you it was you.
Right. Anyway, so hey, Rob, great conversation today. I really appreciate it. I think we got a lot of information to the audience. Obviously, by the questions, I think they got a lot out of it, and it was real informative. So thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you. This was great. I hope the attendees really enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to doing this again.
Yeah, as do I. Everyone in the audience, thank you very much for your participation, for listening. Thanks for the questions. It always helps make a really great webcast for us. And this concludes today's webcast, and we'll catch you on the next one.